So this video is for my Catholic brothers and sisters out there who are seeking the truth. This is my third question. It's on the perpetual virginity of Mary. Basically, the doctrine goes that Mary was a virgin when Jesus was born and remained a virgin throughout her whole life. The brothers and sisters that are mentioned in the New Testament have to do with being Joseph's, or written off as Joseph's children from another marriage, and or cousins. I'm not going to go so much into that argument. It's pretty self-explanatory when one just reads the passages that mention about the children or the brothers and sisters of Jesus, in a sense. Nowhere does the New Testament ever translate it as cousins, and in most of the contexts, it doesn't even warrant that type of argument. Now, one thing I noticed, well, first of all, the biggest argument that the Catholic Church uses for this doctrine is taken out of an old New Testament manuscript of the proto-evangelism, I think I pronounced that right, Evangelium of James, which is the infancy gospel of James. And in there it has a story about Mary and how she was raised in the temple for like 9 years, etc., which was apparently not even a Jewish practice. Certain things where Joseph refused to marry her. A lot of things that are actually contradictory to the Gospels, which would be a red flag in itself. Majority of scholars out there write it off as a forgery because it was written in the name of James, the apostle. However, it is dated into the 2nd century, which would be completely impossible for James to have written, for the very fact that he died of stoning as a martyr. So one thing I noticed, first of all and foremost, was that they used the proto-evangelium of James, which it contradicts the Gospels in so many different ways. It contradicts even the Herod searching for the children. Apparently, in this Gospel of James, Jesus is hidden in the manger from Herod and his soldiers, whereas in the other Gospels, they were fleeing to Egypt to get away from Herod. And there's also mention of John the Baptist being his parents fleeing from Herod, and all sorts of things like that too. So there's a lot of contradictions with the gospel accounts, narrative of Jesus, and the account of James, the Gospel of James. Another thing that I would notice too is, which I find quite interesting, is that the Catholics never mention Josephus, at least not that I'm aware of. Josephus was a 1st century Jewish historian, and we get a lot of some of our I guess what you would call historical proofs of Jesus being real from Josephus and the things that he mentions. He mentions things about John the Baptist as well. But interestingly, he mentions James and his martyrdom. But he also mentions him as Jesus, the brother of, or James, the brother of Jesus. and there's no indication at all that he's a cousin or any other brother but a blood brother in a sense. So it's quite interesting because Josephus was not a Christian, so he didn't have any bias towards anything. He wasn't trying to prove Christianity or disprove Christianity, because a lot of people argue that in the Gospels, Jesus' family is kind of not talked about that much, because they wanted to focus more on his deity, who he was, and not so much him as a human person. And so there's some truth to that, I would say too. But with Josephus, he doesn't have to hide any of those things. He's just plainly stating the natural side of Jesus with his natural family, which would have been James, his brother. So those things I would argue as well. There's another argument to be made with the argument that the men that are mentioned as brothers, like James and Judas and whatnot, that they're cousins. The problem with that is, in two different accounts in Acts and in, I believe it's 1 Corinthians 4, Paul mentions as well, and so does Luke in Acts. They use a different word, an entirely different word for cousins. And so there's no indication at all that any of the passages talk about his brothers and sisters, that they're cousins, because they would have used that particular Greek word for cousins and not the word that's being used there. I realize that I'm just kind of throwing these things off the cuff, but I just wanted to get this out. Maybe I'll make a more detailed video if anyone wants to request that. But in a nutshell, another thing actually I wanted to mention was the traditional side of the church on believing this doctrine as a dogma. When you read the early church fathers, it's a 50-50 as far as who believes in the doctrine of the perpetual virginity or not. It's not a set in stone thing where every single early church father was believing this thing. There was a very mixed view of it, all the way through up to even John Calvin, who were Protestants, were actually he was believing in the perpetual virginity. So was Luther. Luther was a little more extravagant on it, but so basically all the way through history, there's kind of like a mixed debate on that kind of thing. So I don't think that tradition really holds to this, especially when your sole proof text is from a forged pseudographical type of work of the Gospel of James, which no scholar believes is genuine. Another thing that I would mention too is, what's interesting is that very time that proto-evangelism of James was written was in the time where Arianism was creeping into the church rapidly. And Arianism believed, of course, that sex was evil, and that even sex inside a marriage was evil, and that people should remain abstinent from sex even in marriage. And so this, I think, carried forward and influenced this work from this pseudographical work of James. And so also crept into the Catholic Church, because they were at that particular time, more into leading into the 3rd and 4th century. They started dogmatically asserting these types of things, especially with the priesthood. There was a mixed bag of reviews with that too, mixed or feelings with that too, because When you read the stance on the church, some were saying, well, they were taking the stance of the apostles, like Peter being married, and so they felt that, if a priest is married, fine, whatever. And then they started kind of slowly distancing themselves from that type of position to a more of a abstinence from marriage, those types of things. And I think a lot of that was influenced by this type of Arianism that was going on. So, with all that being said, you have the historical Josephus um, mentioning a literal brother, James, to Jesus. You have the gospel accounts, which represent, I think, accurately that Mary had children with Joseph. There's no indication that they were cousins. There's no indication that Joseph had children or a marriage before that. There's zero evidence of that in history. Again, the only type of argument that someone might make is from that pseudographical work of James, which really is a forgery, and a lot of it is historically inaccurate in a sense. So I think there's a lot to be said with this, and I think as a Catholic, you really need to think this thing through. You don't have tradition really standing behind this. You don't have history standing behind this. You don't have the Gospels, the Scriptures standing behind this. And certainly you don't have the early church fathers standing behind this as well, and to a great degree. Anyway, I hope this helps, and God bless. We'll talk to you then.